conducted off online. Am I audible?
Yes, yes, you are.
Yes. So we have with us Dr. Niveditha kalarikkal to converse with us on the topic bridging the cultural gap, uh, language planning, educational policies, and the role of translation in India. She's an assistant professor at Center for Comparative Literature, Calicut University, and she has taught in Central University of Gujarat from 2013 to 21. She obtained her PhD in the area of translation studies from Central University of Hyderabad. Her area of interest include post-colonial studies, print culture studies, modern Indian literature, and so on. And she has contributed to several journals and articles. Her recent publications include print translation uh, at the rise of the vernacular in Words in Words, 200 years of Malayalam printing. Uh, so I welcome ma'am to our research forum. I think now you may proceed.
Thank you, Sayujia, for the introduction. And thank you, the English Department of Calicut University, for giving me this opportunity to interact with the students. Actually, Sayujia had requested me to present something related to literature per se. But since it was like there was shortage of time and I was busy with other things, I thought like, okay, I'll just present something which I've been working on recently. Rather than trying to present something something which is related to translation studies. I hope I am audible to you, right? Am I audible?
Yes, you are. You are.
Okay, fine. Yeah, so that is how I ended up with this topic. I'm not sure if the English department there have a component of translation studies or readings related to translation per se, but I'm sure that this would be like taken up later for your research or something, at least for some of you. And I have slides with me. I'll share the slides with you. One second. Is it visible?
Not yet. Not yet. Yeah, now I think it's coming. I think.
Visible, right? Yeah. So, there are too many components, as you can see in the title slide itself. So, there is a reference to how translations are trying to bridge the cultural gap that exists among like languages and cultures. Then, how language planning and education policies can make an impact or can have an impact on bridging, whether to bridge the cultural gap or otherwise, whatever it is. Like we'll try to find out or think about it more in detail, maybe like as part of the discussion or at the end of the presentation. And specifically, how translation as a practice has been figuring in this, like some of these language planning that has been done in India and some of the major educational policies that were devised in the last like one or two decades specifically. I'll just go to the presentation as it. So like there are roughly speaking, my presentation can be divided into three sections. So chronologically, the early translations that occurred in the colonial times during the company rule and after the establishment of the Queen's rule in India itself. Translations between Indian languages and English and vice versa, and its impact, and the related debates about what kinds of translation practice should be there and all that. Those kinds of debates would be dealt with in the first section. And then coming to the second section of my presentation, it's mostly dealing with what was happening in the translation scene in India in the 20th century per se, like especially in the post-colonial situation or post-independence scenario, like roughly 50 to 60 years after independence, the second half of the 20th century. And then the third section, which is more elaborate and where most of the discussion is there, we'll be dealing with sorry, one second. There is some call coming. Sorry.
Uh, Excuse me, Miss
Yeah.
Niveditha, your slides are not moving.
But I can see the
Excuse
slide. I'm able to see the
Okay,
slide.
okay.
Yeah,
So
I
probably,
haven't moved the slide. You can see the title slide, right? Hello.
Yes, Nivedita.
Yeah. What happened?
No, I think somebody said she cannot see the slide. Who was it who
Okay.
said that?
Should I share it again? Try sharing it again.
Uh, yeah, if it's not a hassle, you can. But
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
many of us can see the page, so I don't know what's the problem.
Okay. I'll try sharing it once again. Let me see. Is it okay now?
Can
yes,
everybody
it is
see
fine.
it? Can
It's
everyone
fine
see
now.
it?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Fine. Yeah. So then the third section will be mostly focusing on the recent policies, like government policies. One is specifically related to education, as we all know, the National Education Policy document, like 2020, which is called as NEP. And the other one, a little earlier, like the beginning of this century, you might have heard of the National Knowledge Commission report that came out in 2006. So the third section will be looking into both these policy documents, which are related to, like, which talk in detail about what you call as the language policy that the government of India is planning to adopt, and also where a policy for translation, or how to undertake translations between Indian languages and foreign languages, and English. Like, I won't bracket English as like specifically Indian or foreign. Like, it's a debatable issue, right? So all these translations between all these are talked about in detail as part of these policy documents. So that will be the third section, basic. That will be discussed in the third section. So I'll go to the first section. I hope the slide is visible. Diverse practices to a uniformly administered unit. Where I'm talking about basically focusing on what you call as the colonial situation, or what was the situation in the case of 18th or 19th century, when the British was, or when it was the East India Company, or later when the Crown establishes a direct rule, the multilingual situation, which was norm in the Indian context, and multilingualism, as we see now, is seen as an aberration, or not the norm anymore. Especially in the post-independence time period, when we have regions, or political units called as states, divided based on languages, like linguistic states. But when we look at the 19th century scenario, as most of us know, multilingualism and heteroglossia, the existence of like multiple varieties of what you call as varieties of languages within what you call as the singular language itself, was the norm of the time period. So everybody in India living at that time period would have been comfortable using 3 or 4 varieties of tongues. I won't call it as language per se. Like, people may call many of them as dialects, or as idioms, or like what you call jargons, etc., etc. Whatever it is, like languages which are, or varieties which are used in different domains of your life. Everybody would have been proficient in, or would have been using multiple varieties of tongues, which would have been which would have been the part and parcel of what you call as existence in the 19th century Indian scenario. So the diversity in linguistic as well as cultural practices. So the diversity is not something which is restricted to linguistic practices, but to cultural practices also, which was not a challenge as far as the common people, or the people who would have been living at that time period were concerned. But from an administrative point of view, when the British administrators were given a situation where they have to manage such a diverse linguistic and cultural like groups, then administrative ease would be at stake. Then as a measure to what you call address this challenge, in a way we can see that this idea of uniform universal education, to impart uniform education to all the Indians, would have been a measure, or we can consider it as a measure taken up by the British to in a way address this challenge. That is where this identification of classified languages out of this multilingual heteroglossia situation, to have a set of classified languages as major vernaculars or regional languages, and to have other languages labeled as dialects or minor languages, and accordingly like major cultures or minor cultures, these kinds of divisions would have occurred or have occurred along with this practice of classification. And the designing of educational policies along with this administrative practices of studying or documenting languages is also interesting in that case, because this design of educational policies included a lot of debates, whether to go by the Orientalist path or to have an Anglicist position. Many of us are familiar with that, the Orientalist debate and the Anglicist debate in the 19th century context, where the Orientalists were, the educationalists among British administrators who were Orientalists were arguing that we should use Indian literature itself as, or Indian literatures through translations, translations from English languages into Indian literatures can be used as a tool for imparting education. While where Indian literature or like Indian literature which is created anew, or Indian literatures in Indian languages, it themselves can be used as what you call as media for education. But on the other hand, the Anglicist position was that Indian languages or literatures are not to be considered as important. Rather, Western knowledges, which are mostly like available in English or other European languages, have to be imparted through the common or uniform universal education program. And that is where the role of translation in rendering new knowledge system to natives find a place. So the Anglicist position finally wins. It is not the case that translation becomes an important activity only in what you call as this the Anglicist enterprise. Orientalists also use translation as a tool, especially for like the Orientalist practice of translating Indian literatures into Indian languages, which creates something called as what you call as a corpus of what is considered as an Indian literature per se, which became available as representing India for the outside world. And it's the Anglicist enterprise of educating Indians in Western knowledges or Western sciences, which in a way what it was promoted the translations from mostly from English and to some extent from other European languages and literatures, and even knowledge texts from Western or European context to Indian languages. So the winning of the Anglicist position in a way led to the transference of knowledge texts or literary texts into the Indian languages, mostly from English. And we can see that during the colonial times, it's not just the administrative machinery, as in not just the educationalists or administrators who are part of the British machinery, who are undertaking this translation mission, but there were people, the newly educated natives, like English educated or otherwise, they were also taking up translation projects as one of their major, one among the major enterprises that they, modernizing enterprises specifically undertaken by the natives. So the efforts of natives in translation of texts across foreign and Indian languages were, to some extent, part of building literary canons. The building of literary canons for modern Indian languages itself is largely enriched through these practices of translations from English and other European languages. So it was not just for building literary canons, but for educational purposes. For example, towards the end of 19th century or the beginning of 20th century, we can see that the natives themselves became participants, or they were crucial in the textbook committees in Travancore, or in the Malabar region, which was under the what you call as Madras presidency at that time. So, for example, Travancore textbook committee, and people like Kerala Varma Valiyagoi Tamburan, who were what you call as giving a lot of emphasis on translation practice, took a keen interest in translating texts into like Malayalam or other Indian languages. So, for example, Bhasha Shakuntalam, the translation of from what you call Sanskrit to Malayalam, which is considered as which is called as Bhasha Shakuntalam by Kerala Varma Valiyagoi Tamburan, is an example where not just from English or other European languages, but also from what you call as classical texts like Sanskrit, or rarely from Tamil, texts were translated into so-called vernacular languages, within quote unquote vernacular languages like Malayalam. So those kinds of translations were also undertaken towards the end of the 19th century, or early years of the 20th century, apart from the administrative translation practices. And coming to the post-independence scenario, we can see that that's early years of independence, like 1950s or 60s. We can see that, and as different from the 19th century scenario, where the Orientalist project was in a way creating what you call as something called as Indian literature in English to some extent, through translations, or representing India in translations to some extent in English. As different from that, the translation practice that you can see just after independence, undertaken by people like K. Ramanujan or Dilip Chitre or Sujit Mukherjee, was trying to pitch this activity of translation within a regional framework, to be specific. So that is what Sachin Ketkar, who is a translation studies specialist, observes. So Sachin says that, his point is that basically, like if you look at Ramanujan's translation, so his translation of Vachana poetry, so very, very specifically located within Kannada literature, and specifically within the communities within which the Vachana poetry is located, and also the specific regional context, regional framework from which translations into English, happening into English, are projected through these translation enterprises, rather than having a pan-Indian literary scenario being projected through English translations. It is the specific regional framework that is projected through these translation enterprises. And we also know that after the setting up of Sahitya Academy, which has, which doesn't necessarily have, or was not projected as a nationalist enterprise per se, but finally ended up as something of that sort, where Nehru himself, when he presided the first session of Sahitya Academy, says that the Prime Minister's office doesn't have to do anything with the Sahitya Academy's proceedings. But in a way, we can see that the translation efforts undertaken by Sahitya Academy ended up creating a corpus of translations across Indian languages, where translation becomes a tool for creating a corpus of what can be considered as Indian, something which can be called as Indian literature in translation across Indian languages, and from Indian languages to English or vice versa, could be created. So other than that, we can see that the later part of the 20th century, in the later part of the 20th century, there were not many efforts in translation, like not many major efforts in translation can be talked about. Or it was not part of educational planning in the 20th century per se. And we also know about the controversial three-language formula, which was proposed in 1968, and how the Tamil nationalist sentiment arose, and how the three-language formula had to, that itself came as a part of this demand from many of the regional groups, saying that Hindi cannot, projecting of Hindi and English as the official languages can be problematic, and Hindi getting an upper hand over other regional so-called vernaculars as labeled by the British can be problematic, etc. But the three-language formula, which was proposed in 1968 as part of the National Policy Resolution, which tried to address this issue of different linguistic and cultural groups, which are now solidified in the post-independence scenario as what you call as political units, like linguistic units transforming into or getting translated into cultural or political identities per se, where a sense of belongingness, regional belongingness embedded within the nation is already there. And the three-language formula is trying to, in a way, kind of tackle this situation where the regional embeddedness within a national framework had to be ensured, and that is the project behind this three-language formula. But it ended up in failure, specifically because with this Hindi, English, and any modern Indian language is the basic principle. But in the non-Hindi speaking states, one regional language which has to be taught from the regions taken up as it. So, and the question from Tamil Nadu, etc., was that why should Hindi be imposed on Tamilians? Like Hindi is just another language, just as Tamil is. And about the historicity, or like how old are languages, the classical status of languages, all these were debated upon. And in a way, three-language policy was not effectively implemented everywhere, though to some extent, like in Kerala and all, we had educational policy of that kind. So, yeah. So translation of administrative, but at the same time, we can see that translation of administrative and official documents into Hindi, owing to its status as the Raj Bhasha, or the official language, as a primary activity, was going on in the 20th century and extending to the 21st century. By 21st century, we can see that there are these Hindi pakwadas, or fortnightly celebrations of Hindi were encouraged and all that. So there is a growing prominence for Hindi as an official language, like as equal to English, and translations happening from Hindi or to Hindi are occurring more in number. And interestingly, there is this work by Baldev Rajnair, where you can see that he has made some observations about language policies adopted by like nation states, especially post-independent nation states. And this work is National Communication and Language Policy in India. That is his work, where he observes that in most of the countries where the state has preceded the nation, so in the Indian context also, some kind of a governmental mechanism which unified different regions was existing from the pre-colonial times because of the colonial government in place. But the national sentiment, or the idea of a unified nation in place, was not existing just because the colonial machinery or governmental machinery was in place. So in those scenarios, where in those kinds of what I call as post-colonial situations, post-colonial nation states, efforts at, I quote, integration pertaining to a national allegiance on the part of the population, unquote, in order to inculcate a sense of community is usually present in those situations where the state has preceded the nation, according to Baldev Rajnair. I'll come back to Rajnair's observations later in my presentations when I come to the discussions on NEP. Right now, I am just leaving it. And we can see what is happening. Like if this kind of an integrationist project was in place, or what was happening in the policy documents, or what was given emphasis in what is being given emphasis in the policy documents that were published, especially from the central government's part in the 21st century scenario. I hope things are clear till now. Like, are the slides visible and am I audible?
Yes, Niveditha, it is
Okay,
audible. It is visible also. Yeah.
Okay, fine. So when we look at this policies, the central government policies that recently came out in the 21st century, both these, like I'm focusing mostly on both these two documents. One is the National Knowledge Commission report, the National Knowledge Commission was instituted in 2005 under Dr. Manmohan Singh when he was the Prime Minister, and the report came out in 2006. And the next one is the recent one, which was much debated and talked upon in the last 2 years. So the National Education Policy, or the NEP document, which came out in 2020. So both these documents, when we look at these documents, we can see that there is a centrality for translation and language planning. Like the thing that we have to talk about or think about is language planning as an exercise in most of the cases take part of education planning, or to some extent as part of planning as administrative planning proper. Here I am talking about or giving more emphasis on how education policies or planning in relation to education has tried to talk about or has brought in language planning in an indirect way, and how translations would figure in or are given a particular role as part of this language planning in these educational policy documents. So translations are essential components in these the discussions that appear in the policy documents. And in both these documents, whether it's the National Knowledge Commission report or whether it's NEP document, in both these translations are seen as essential components in the overall developmental paradigm of the nation state itself. So that kind of a prominence is given to translation activity or translations as products. So when we look at the NKC report, or I'll be calling it as NKC report from now on, a National Knowledge Commission report. So it clearly states its objective. So when we think about or when we discuss the translation activity that is promoted, or the role that is given to translation in these reports, we also have to place the translation project in place within the larger philosophy of the policy document per se. So in the case of NKC report, we can see that NKC report gave a clear emphasis on building a knowledge society. So it is envisioning India as a knowledge society, and it has guidelines that envisions the creation of a knowledge society, India as a knowledge society, and how translations can play an important role in achieving this objective. And this NKC report showcases that education is a means of achieving personal growth and development. So it elaborately talks about how education can play a role in the personal growth and development of an individual. And from there, it also tries to address how what you call as matters of policy, education, especially in the matters of education policy, can be crucial in decentralization, administrative decentralization, and how community participation at the local level is very important in administering such a vast, culturally diverse, linguistically diverse country like India, and how translations can play a major role in achieving this decentralization, because education and administration are what you call as interconnected. Educating individuals or the younger generation is inherently connected with what you call as the effective implementation of policies. Therefore, the decentralization of administrative mechanisms and how effectively community participation can be ensured within this administrative practices through practices of translation is talked about in detail in the NKC report. And we can see that these guidelines that envision India as a knowledge society is given because the NKC report thinks that it is necessary to increase India's competitive advantage in various fields of knowledge. So not just in one particular field of knowledge, but there should be text available in various fields of knowledge in Indian languages. And interestingly, we can see that in order to maximize public benefit, how this policy can maximize public benefit is being talked about. And another interesting, when we look at the overall philosophy of the NKC report, we can see that there is an affirmation that a proper understanding and command over English language is an important determinant of access to higher education and employment. So, on the one hand, there is an emphasis on decentralization and participation of local communities, local cultural groups, and who are divided or who might be divided across languages and cultural groups. But at the same time, English is given a special status in the report as such. In the overall philosophy of NKC report, English plays an important position. It is a determinant in accessing higher education. At the level of higher education, English has to play a role. And there is this recommendation that English should be introduced along with the first language from standard 1 onwards. That is how English was introduced from standard 1 onwards, class 1 onwards. Because the lack of access to English education among rural groups and especially among young people was seen as an impediment, as a major impediment that was stopping the effective absorption of various streams of knowledge among diverse groups of Indian people. So English should be made accessible through various means, not only through classroom teaching from first standard onwards, but through formation of knowledge clubs to discuss and disseminate knowledge of English outside the classroom, etc., etc. So there were various measures that were projected through these, through the Knowledge Commission report. So the urgent need to expand the quantity and improve the quality of translation was another major recommendation of this Knowledge Commission report. The report identifies that there is an asymmetric flow of information, which means that it's most of the important scientific and social sciences knowledge are existing in English language, and the Indian languages or the regional languages doesn't have much of information that's available in the social sciences or the natural sciences information or knowledges are mostly available in English. And so there is an asymmetric flow of information that is existing, which needs to be addressed through translation. So that is where the role for translation is emphasized in the National Knowledge Commission report. So there are sections specifically related to translation practice, which are there in the report. One is the report says that there should be efforts to promote different types of translation, human, machine-aided, or instant translations, or interpretations. Those kinds of efforts should be taken up. And translations in different domains of knowledge or domains of life, like literary translations, scientific translations, technical, business translations, etc., etc. And that is how, as part of this NKC report, that National Translation Mission, which is now instituted within the CIL Mysore, Central Institute of Indian Languages, Mysore, was instituted. And National Translation Mission was supposed to take up the following measures, areas where the National Translation Mission was to focus on. One is to impart quality training and education for translators, and to create and maintain tools that can aid translation. And the next one is to translate pedagogic materials, especially in natural and social sciences. That is one of the major projects of this National Translation Mission, especially in higher education, creating textbooks and knowledge material for higher education purposes in the major scheduled Indian languages, the 22 languages of India. Then to create a national register for translators, comprising of updated information on translations which are already published in Indian languages, to have training programs, and to create translation tools for Indian languages, etc. And also to update Indian languages by promoting translations from English. So it's mostly a one-way traffic, like translations from English into Indian languages, whether of knowledge text, literary text, or other texts, was the major idea that is promoted by the NKC report. And National Translation Mission was also focusing mostly on that. And projecting Indian languages and literatures within and outside South Asia through translation is also there, but it didn't figure in as a major objective of National Translation Mission or the NKC report in its actual practice. And coming to the next report, which was published like almost 14 years after that, that's the recent one, the NEP 2020, which is in the case of NKC, it was not a report on education or like education. It was not a policy report on education per se. It was largely like aimed at creating how to make India into a knowledge society, where the connection between knowledge and the political economy was clearly what you call as talked about. But in the case of NEP, it is like clearly an education policy per se. And I'm extensively quoting from the National Education Policy Report per se. And the page number 6 of the report, you can see that it says that, which reveals to us the larger philosophy of the policy itself. So it's aimed at transforming India, that is Bharat, sustainably into an equitable and vibrant knowledge society. So again, knowledge society is central, like making India into a knowledge society is central. And it also aims at this idea that by 2040, like almost everybody in India will have access to the highest quality education for all learners, regardless of social or economic background. And there is also an emphasis on multidisciplinarity, and also it emphasizes on holistic education. And the report criticizes the existing the prior policies or education policies or practices or pedagogical methods, saying that the rote learning has been the practice or the pedagogical methods that are existing are basically like emphasizing rote learning and nothing more. And what we need, or the need of the hour, is holistic education and multidisciplinary education, etc., etc. And the report says that, I quote, promoting multilingualism and the power of language in teaching and learning are to be emphasized, etc. So, and the report also says that there should be respect for diversity and respect for local context in all curriculum, pedagogy and policy, as well as, again, a rootedness and pride in India and its rich, diverse, ancient and modern culture and knowledge systems and traditions. So, it is paradoxical to some extent, like the way it talks about diversity and respect for local context in the curriculum, and at the same time, on the other hand, it's talking about rootedness and pride in India and its rich, diverse, ancient and modern culture and knowledge systems and traditions, etc., etc. So, in a way, like as something mentioned in a document, these two extremes can very well be incorporated. But in actual practice, how this is going to happen and going to be implemented is one thing that we have to, especially in connection with what would be the role that translations have to play in this kind of a project, and how actual translations would be undertaken as part of this educational policy project and all will have to be thought about, which I'll talk about it, like which we will see when we look at the nuances of the report in detail. The report talks about this new classification. While the National Knowledge Commission report is mostly talking about Indian languages and English, the wide variety of languages that exist in Indian context, or in a way the actual multilingual scenario or the heteroglossic scenario existing in the Indian context is talked about in the National Education Policy report. So there are these categorizations like home languages or mother tongues. Home languages bar mother tongues. Then there is another classification of the regional languages or local languages. Then comes other classical languages, etc. So there is a variety of hierarchy of languages and textual practices or spoken practices which are talked about in detail or addressed in the policy report. And the report emphasizes the use of mother tongue or home language as the medium of instruction, which is a complete deflection from the NKC report's prioritizing of English. That is what is interesting. It's not the regional or local languages and the language of the linguistic states like Malayalam or Hindi or Tamil or Kannada. Rather different from that, like it's going one level down to the level of like mother tongue, which shouldn't necessarily be the regional language. That's why the term home language is specifically introduced in the report as the medium of instruction. So translation as a practice, in the sense like not the traditional idea of translation proper as an interaction between like two languages per se, But translation as a practice in classroom teaching, as part of the pedagogy, is introduced in an interesting way as part of the NEP. So translation is at the core of the teaching learning process according to the new policy, and a tool to handle the multilingual situation that is existing in India. Translations are to be promoted to ensure foundational literacy in all local Indian languages by creating enjoyable and inspirational books for students at all levels. That is what the NEP documents says. And role of bilingualism, I'll be coming to that in the next slide. Role of translation is not restricted to textual translation per se, which can make good the disparity between the home language or the mother tongue and the regional language or the language of curriculum. Which is usually usually the translations between English and regional languages are talked about in the educational planning or policy making enterprises. So language planning in the educational sector usually looks at English or the official languages and the regional languages. But here the role of translation in bridging the disparity between home language or the mother tongue and the regional languages are also talked about in detail. That is why we can see that the bridging the gap between levels of linguistic, bridging the gap between different levels of linguistic and cultural embeddedness in which the student, average Indian student is given emphasis in the NEP. But it's interesting in a way, like the propositions of NEP or the actual guidelines that NEP gives to how to go about with this bridging the gap mission is interesting. So there is an emphasis on bilingualism. So bilingualism is supposed to be the mode within the classroom. A teacher or an instructor is supposed to use bilingual teaching practices or teaching learning, not only materials, but actual teaching should be bilingual in both languages. That is shown to be as projected as the means to bridge the gap between the home language and the medium of instruction, the gap between both these. So like if in the case of minor languages or tribal languages and orators, or the languages which are without scripts, which are considered as dialects and all that. So one is, as a teacher, one is supposed to be proficient in these local regional languages and the media of instruction, which is usually the regional local languages, or in some cases it can be English. So that kind of a bilingual scenario in the classroom, a practical translation in the classroom is what is what it was put forth by the NEP policy document. So multilingual atmosphere is talked about more as a strength rather than as a constraint in the NEP document, which is interesting. And the NEP document, I quote from the document that all textbooks shall aim to contain the essential core material deemed important on a national level, but at the same time contain any desired nuances and supplementary material as per local context and needs. So again, this effort to bridge the national scenario with the very localized, not even the regional, but the local context, is given emphasis. And textbooks to be, that are to be prepared through translation has to keep both these things in mind. So any core teaching material that is to be prepared has to be prepared in with this idea in mind. So and I am quoting again from the document. So it says that the unity and beautiful cultural heritage and diversity of India is to be introduced. So an introduction to the nature, structure and commonly used phrases of tribal languages to the students of grade 5 to 8 in India is suggested. So in order to impart an idea of or give a taste of the unity and beautiful cultural heritage of India, both these, with the particular a taste of the tribal languages or the very minor languages of India has to be introduced from grade 5 to 8. And in the case of major Indian languages, the scheduled languages remain to have that status. And in the case of introducing, so another interesting thing is there is a policy of particular intercultural communication, or the principle of intercultural communication lies behind, or that is underneath the dying underneath this idea of what happened?
Can you wrap?
Time limit. Yeah, I'll wrap it up in 5 minutes. Huh? Okay. Yeah. So this using translations as a tool for intercultural communication, like in the case of major Indian languages, that's what is proposed in the case of like the regional languages. I'll just wrap it up in 5 minutes. Yeah. So what I'm trying to argue is that as different from the role that translations were supposed to play in the National Knowledge Commission report, while we come to the NEP, there is a clear policy of national integration where translation as a tool will be used mostly for intercultural communication, but with a what you call as a national integrationist project in place, where to retain the hierarchy of the major literary languages, mother tongues, then minority languages, etc., intact by adopting a differential approach to the levels of exposure that will be given to these languages is through educational programs is what is noteworthy. So a selective preservation and circulation of mainstream literatures and cultures is what is advised, while like especially through translations. And other efforts at enhancing intercultural communication is also tabled. An emphasis and interestingly, like English is not like the role that English has to play, which English used to play otherwise, as in practice of translation across Indian languages or between Indian languages and other foreign languages. English as a linked language is not talked about at all. There is a silence about the role of English or in the practice of translation or in the language policy per se, or like education policy per se, where there is an emphasis on classical languages and texts, and also translations of texts in Indian languages with the goal of enhancing intercultural communication, as well as translations from foreign languages like Japanese or like other major European languages into Indian languages has to be introduced, like as mere linguistic transactions, not as at the level of what you call as intercultural transaction, but just as a mere linguistic transaction. So there is again a gradation there in the kind of translations that are made.
Hello.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's okay. You don't have to read it fast.
Okay, fine. Yeah. So this is the last slide, anyways. The way in which NEP gives emphasis to translation is like very clear in the final quote. That India will also urgently expand its translation and interpretation efforts in order to make high quality learning materials and other important written and spoken materials available to the public in various Indian and foreign languages. For this, an Indian Institute of Translation and Interpretation will be established. Such an institute would provide a truly important service for the country, as well as employ numerous multilingual language and subject experts and experts in translation and interpretation, which will help to promote all Indian languages. So this is what the NDP report. So just like the National Translation Mission was instituted by the National Knowledge Commission, there is a proposal for now. The National Translation Mission is not functional anymore, not full-fledged in its functioning. An Indian Institute of Translation and Interpretation with the above said what it is goals in mind will be instituted. So where the gradation of or the emphasis on translation between Indian like major scheduled Indian languages in the creation of knowledge texts or curriculum will be emphasized, while the intercultural communication aspect is not given that much of an emphasis through translation practice while introducing the local like languages or mother tongues person. So it's interesting in that sense where this like an integrationist line where this diverse linguistic and cultural groups in the country has to be integrated. So I am going back to the work by Nair, where National Communication and Language Policy in India, where he talks about this capacity to communicate and is usually considered as central to the idea of creating a national community. So that's why education policies give so much of an importance to discussing about like what role languages can play, or what roles translation activities can play, etc. So, in order to, in an effort to create this something called as a national community, or which is central to like intercultural communication, as long as the linguistic communities remain to be like separate cultural communities in the Indian context. This NEP document can be seen as a very clearly a kind of an integrationist project, and where in the kind of classroom interactions that will be happening, like where the very localized communities will be integrated into the regional and to the pan-Indian scenarios through what it was translation practice as part of the very pedagogy itself. For not only for curriculum development, but which becomes part of the very teaching learning process, is interesting in that sense. So that is it, and I stop here, and I like to listen to you and your comments and criticisms or whatever. Like, yeah.
So thank you, ma'am, for that elaborate presentation. Now the forum is open for discussions. So if we have any questions, you can raise it, and if you have any comments, please share. Translation studies is not everybody's cup of tea, but still, if
Okay.
if anyone is interested, I think they can.
Okay.
Please be feel to interact.
I think there are no questions as such. No, nothing is there in the dialogue box.
I think since there is a lot about that education policies and so on, I think nobody's aware much about all.
Aware of it, yeah, yeah. No,
Now
not
we are in
something
a
usually discussed in a literature department, no?
yeah, yes, that's why I think.
Uh,
Since we are in a scenario where one of a literature written in Indian language has received a Booker Prize now, I think uh, a discussion about translation studies is actually relevant.
Actually,
Relevant, I think, because
yeah,
it is that translation which received that prize. I think. Otherwise, that book
exactly.
would have remained in the context of Hindi literature itself. Nobody would have
Yeah,
known about it. So,
yeah.
translation has a great role to do, especially in India, as you said.
Yeah, yeah. Most of the Indian literatures get some kind of visibility through English translations only.
English translation.
Yeah. And we know many
And
of the Latin American writers through translations only. We think
yes,
of them as writing in English most of the time, right? We
yes,
think that
true.
yeah, Latin American writers write in English.
And we do know about the writers in next state also in such a way, I think. In the very next
Otherwise,
state like Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, that our Girish Karnad, everybody came to know,
yeah,
familiar to us only because those
the
translations.
translations are available. Yeah.
And the thing you said about that regional language, mother tongue and
Ah,
local, that is actually a good point. I think we did not. I personally had not paid attention to such a separation
okay.
till now.
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, we usually take it for